Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Chris Jennings.
Joining us today for another update, we did something similar to this last year, is Kevin Kraai, the Texas Parks and Wildlife Waterfowl Program Leader. Kevin, welcome back to the DU Podcast.
Glad to be back. It's been a while and looking forward to visiting with you guys.
Absolutely. No, we've got an email this week that you guys, recently published the results of your midwinter waterfowl survey, and it is super exciting to see for us. We just kind of like to see how the distributions are going. I'm sure that it's awesome for you. But before we get into the numbers, let's do kind of a recap of, Texas waterfowl season. This is, we're in the last week of January. I don't know specifically when, your seasons are closing, but, I know it's coming to an end for sure. So let's talk about, from the beginning to the end.
Yeah. So, like you said, we are in our last 2 weekends. So we close the last Sunday in January.
Okay.
So I believe that's the 29th or 30th. But yeah, so it was a very interesting year. Obviously, coming into the season, there was a lot of uncertainty associated with, the drought in the prairies, conversations about duck numbers, potentially even being low enough to trigger something other than a liberal season for the first time in 27 years or 25 years, something like that. And so, going into it, the reality is we had a really, really wet June and July. So across the board, the state of Texas was looking really good. August hit, and not only was it wet in June and July, it was abnormally cool. All the way to deep South Texas, it was abnormally cool. So we weren't getting those horrible hot temperatures. But August hit, and boy, did it change. The rain machine stopped, the heat came, and it changed the entire landscape for the state of Texas, like overnight. High Plains playas almost completely dried up in September and October. Just a handful of basins holding water. To this day, when there was a large percentage of them holding water early, East Texas reservoirs started receding quickly, and then even all the way down to the Gulf Coast prairies and marshes, things were changing pretty rapidly. So the good news is our September teal hunting, especially on the Gulf Coast and the prairies, was very successful. We had those that had water shot a lot of teal. Yeah. Parts of northeast Texas, it was almost, for the most part, didn't exist as a teal season. There wasn't the kind of water that they were looking for, unfortunately. And so, we had a good teal season, and people were pretty successful in places. And big duck season rolls around, it still hasn't gotten wet. We're still abnormally warm. Long story short, it ended up being one of the driest winters on record for the state of Texas, at least during our duck season. December was officially the driest December in history, warmest. And then the drought just started setting in and getting worse and worse across most of the state. And we definitely were hearing it, either from the hunters or from our WMA managers. Success was not great. As a whole for the state of Texas. People were saying it's some of the worst they've seen. The bays were empty. The ponds of Central Texas and East Texas were empty. A lot of this I saw with my own eyes. I mean, it was real. And so it was, kind of looking gloom and doom leading up to our midwinter survey, which is, typically the first week of January. And as many will recall, that we had a New Year's front that came in New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, and it was a really significant front that made it all the way to the Gulf Coast. And just a few days later, it was followed up with a repeat. And ultimately, that was a game changer for duck hunters in the state of Texas. Literally overnight, people started saying, I'm seeing birds finally. Birds are on ponds. I'm shooting quite a few. And so it kind of saved our season. Yeah. The month of January was pretty much, for most people, that's all the season really ended up being or is. And luckily we still have a couple weekends left. And, so the interesting part is leading up into the midwinter survey, it was looking bad. And, we're on the heels of a 2021 midwinter survey that was the lowest on record for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
It was the lowest number we've seen since we've changed survey methodology. So last year we had a very, very low number. It was looking like we were going to probably go lower than that.
Wow.
And those 2 January fronts really changed everything for a good portion of the state. We were able to get the airplanes up and get a good look at the landscape. And ultimately, we had about a 50% increase from last year, our total duck estimate for the state of Texas. And, that's fantastic. It's good to see. But you also got to remember that's 50% increase from the all-time low. So
yeah,
we really didn't have anywhere to go but up. So
yeah. Well, I just find it's a little bit, going back because we had a conversation at the beginning of teal season this year, and I remember you specifically saying, like, man, like we are in great, like everywhere in Texas appears to be in pretty good shape habitat wise, and it's like
we were.
The moment that that podcast went out,
yep,
everything changed. It's like things started to decline. So it's interesting to hear, how quickly that habitat changed and how hunters all were impacted by that. So, greatly. And I heard some good things, especially early. Everyone was pretty happy in Texas that I talked to. Now, granted, most of the guys I talked to were on the coast or, kind of that, coastal prairie area. Some of those ag fields down there had water, it didn't matter if the drought for them as much. But so it's interesting to hear, that whole month of December, was really a struggle for guys in Texas. And
it really was. Yeah. There's places down there in the coastal prairie and that rice prairie where we have, individual clubs, individual landowners that, are investing, ridiculous amounts of money and time to put water on the landscape for their hunters. And they were very, very successful. As a matter of fact, it's years like this that they're most successful because they, are kind of the island of water that exists on the landscape. And they had lots of birds, but the shocking part was you can get just a couple miles past their fence and the skies are empty.
Yeah. Just
absolutely empty. And then you go to some of their properties, where they have sanctuary or, some of the fields they even hunt and rotate and it just looks, like what's the problem? But it was a small area for, when you start thinking about the big picture, especially when you start getting down to the coastal marsh and up and down into the bay system. It was, there was a lot of frustrated hunters, with empty skies.
Yeah.
The reality is it's a multifaceted equation of why ducks migrate and things, but that those warm, dry temperatures throughout most of the fall extended well up the flyway.
Yeah.
And there was just on the phone with my colleague in Nebraska, and they were breaking temperature records in December as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was we never had that push this year. And you couple that with low production, not as many juveniles in the flock. We were kind of getting both barrels of that equation. And when you start looking, and we'll talk about in a minute, when you start peeling back some of the layers of the onion and look at where we did find birds in the state of Texas, it's a big state, so it's not all the same story as you can imagine. And we've talked about before, but like Northeast Texas, where we saw very few birds, even after those 2 fronts, we still saw very few birds. It's not a agricultural dominated landscape. It's horse pastures and hay fields and cut over bottoms. And so it's kind of, not ideal for waterfowl anymore. And what draws ducks to that landscape, what draws ducks to East Texas is big rain events, flooding events, rivers that get out of their banks, sheet water on the landscape, ponds that are swollen into terrestrial vegetation. That new water, that new food resource that suddenly enters the landscape after those big rain events. And we've never had a single rain event like that all year.
Wow.
And so there's just nothing was there to really draw birds to that landscape. It definitely got a little better after those fronts and started getting some better reports, but nothing like it should be. Ultimately, our survey results showed the lowest estimate we ever have had for ducks in the oaks and prairies of East and North Texas. So, do
you get some feedback from from people out there that maybe don't necessarily understand how just a couple little rain events can really be a game changer for people in that area.
Right.
Do people kind of understand that?
You deal with some of these hunters have been around a long time, and 20, 30 years ago, Northeast Texas was kind of the mallard capital of Texas, and they had really good hunting consistently, and things have just kind of stabilized, which is never good for duck habitat. You like change.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're used to better hunting, and when they see these things change, they get frustrated.
Yeah.
And I understand that for sure. And they start asking questions, and you do try your best to explain to them what is the attractant these days. Our bottomlands are not high quality, like you would expect in the White River, and places in Arkansas with a bunch of mass producing trees. But when we do get those big rain events, there's bugs and seeds and just even hay fields. If they get flooded, birds will flock to them. And so, the complaints were there. A lot of hunters did realize that it was warm and they were expecting that, but frustration was still abundant.
Yeah.
And, rightfully so.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's understandable. But that's not something that necessarily we can control there. I think as duck hunters, we try to remain as optimistic as possible when even dealing with, I know just for myself, we dealt with a, really warm, fairly dry over in Arkansas where I hunt. And we still went and maybe we took the focus off of the successful hunting as much as, hey, let's do a prime rib, on the grill.
Right.
Let's, I guess maybe we're still going to duck camp, but we may not shoot any ducks. So I guess that's, and that's frustrating for people too. It can be.
It is.
I guess it's all in the mentality.
Especially those that, have a history of what they've experienced in their past. And so, it's there's a lot of aspects of duck hunting, but people get into duck hunting because they want to shoot some ducks occasionally.
That's right. So absolutely. That's what it's about. Let's get into these midwinter survey results because I think there's a bunch of numbers on here that really jump out to me. And I'm not the scientist type here. We need to have Dr. Mike Brazier on for that, to have him look at the data in that perspective. But when I see some of these big numbers on here, I'm like, oh man, that's awesome. So let's start out. I guess you said we'll start out with the dabblers because that's kind of the top of the chart here. So let's talk about the dabbler distribution in Texas during the survey.
Overall, there's a couple things that really stand out is, the panhandle was very dry, and we were also cold at the time. So what little water we had, most of it was frozen. But if you look at Texas long-term trends in dabblers, it's declining, for the last 26 years for sure. And we did have a little jump this year. And it really came from one location, maybe two. The Rolling Plains is the area of north central Texas, which is, Dallas, Fort Worth, west to, the Caprock, all the way out to San Angelo, up to like Childress. And it's an arid, droughty landscape, but it has, abundant stock ponds on that landscape. And even when it's dry, there's still water in most of them. The cool thing is some of them, it's such a big area. Some of them were, at full stage. Some of them were, receded. But I'd driven through this country a number of times, November and December, and seen almost zero ducks on ponds. And it was a real shock when we got out there in the sky, following those two fronts, seeing the abundance of birds that showed up on those ponds. And most of those birds out there are dabbling ducks, a lot of widgeon, a lot of gadwall, a pretty good number of mallards this year. We counted something like 919,000 ducks in the Rolling Plains.
Wow.
It's the second highest estimate we've ever had for that region.
Yeah.
It was a real shock. I even said something to the other observer. I was like, are you seeing as many ducks out your side of the airplane as I am? Ponds with, 200 and 300 ducks on it, of all kinds of species. Just really wasn't expecting that. So that was a real surprise. But as you went to the coast, dabbler numbers were not as high, even though the coastal estimate was very high. But that was driven by some diving ducks that we found. We'll visit about that in a minute. But really, the only other really good dabbler place this year in Texas, other than Rolling Plains, was South Texas brush country. San Antonio, west to the river, down towards Brownsville, true South Texas.
Yeah.
Again, man-made ponds on the landscape, not near as dense as, say, the rolling plains or the oaks and prairies, but where there was water, where they encountered water, they found ducks.
Yeah.
And I believe they had almost 500,000 birds down there in that landscape, most of which being dabblers as well.
It looks like green wings and gadwalls really made up the large portion of that, which is interesting, based on that kind of landscape.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And it's a landscape that doesn't get a lot of pressure when it is wet, which we had a very wet summer in that landscape in spring, flooding. And a lot of that water persisted in those ponds. Excuse me. And some birds showed up there. And but other than that, East Texas, Northeast Texas dabblers were very, very, very poor. Piney woods, as we call it, we encountered just very few ducks, something like 50,000 total ducks. The oaks and prairies, many years. It's a very large chunk of the state of Texas, east of Dallas to the piney, the pine curtain, if I call it, south all the way down almost to the Texas coast. It's a very large area and very, very abundant water bodies in that landscape. Many, many years it has well over 1 million ducks. In many, many years, it's the number one ecoregion in the state for ducks, especially dabblers. And as a whole, the entire ecoregion, we only counted 200,000 ducks, which, as I mentioned to you earlier, was the lowest estimate we've ever had for that landscape.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of duck hunters in that landscape. I mean, that's where Dallas resides, right? Dallas and Fort Worth. And so there's a lot of duck hunters coming out of that metroplex. And that's where a lot of the frustration was coming from.
Yeah. I mean, it looks like you're down 72% from last year. That's a big number.
Yeah. It's a big decline. And last year was not good. Year, like I said, last year was, at the time, an all-time low as well. So, whatever reason, the birds preferred the stock ponds of the rolling plains this year compared to the oaks and prairies. And that oaks or the rolling plains number really kind of drove up our numbers really good this year. That along with some divers we encountered down on the Texas coast.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because that's one of those numbers on the sheet that just jumps out at you. And it looks like you guys counted, a little over 1.7 million divers throughout Texas. But almost 1.4 of those were redheads on the coast. That's a huge number.
It's enormous, and I know it jumps out. Trust me, I've been getting an earful from everybody.
Brazier's not the only one,
including your friend Mr. Brazier.
He's not the only one to think that there's a mistake there.
Yeah, no, without question. There isn't a mistake. But we do need to kind of explain that number and the methodology at which we survey ducks. The very first thing I want to say is we've been flying this methodology the exact same way in the exact same spots for 26 years. And the reality is, despite hunter reports of the bays being nearly vacant of ducks, which is real, again, remembering that we had two cold fronts, significant cold fronts that we were on the heels of, and things changed real quickly. Despite that, underneath the aircraft, we've never counted more redheads in 26 years. Now, the methodology which we use to sample the landscape, we're not counting every duck in Texas. No way you could do that. So we're literally sampling the landscape. Is that transect methodology, which is, only about a quarter mile wide, and you fly so many miles per transect. And with clump species, the transect methodology kind of starts to fall apart. And what I mean by that is, geese, diving ducks like scaup and redheads, they tend to get in very, very large flocks in, kind of a small area, if you will. Whereas dabbling ducks tend to spread out across the landscape and use the habitats which are available to them. And so the reality is, we flew over more redheads than we've ever flown over in our history, because that estimate, the final estimate of 1.3 million redheads, is the all-time record high for the state of Texas. Yeah. Now, that is a midpoint of the range, if you will. And so it could be as high as a couple million. It could be as low as 400,000. Yeah. That's the way the science works. And so that's the midpoint. And so the reality is, we flew over, our observers flew over a couple of huge rafts of redheads in deep South Texas in the bays. Sometimes, those things go on for miles. Oh, yeah. It just so happened, the weather conditions were perfect. It was calm. They weren't tucked up against some bank hiding. They weren't, just a couple, 100 yards off transect. They happen to be right underneath the transect, and we can't control that. The good news is, that may be an overestimate, but that's what the data showed us.
Yeah.
So in many ways, take it with a grain of salt. The good news is they encountered a pile of redheads.
Yeah.
And that's fact. When you expand that out, it's probably a little high, but that's the way the science works. And so, it's one of those things that it's sometimes difficult to explain, but that's why you don't count geese in that method.
Yeah.
Ideally you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't do that with redheads, but we don't have the resources to go out there and cover every square inch of every single one of our bay systems.
Yeah, absolutely. I just know it's probably very difficult for you guys to post this 1.36 number and having guys calling you like,
especially knowing the feedback I was getting from hunters and what they were seeing in that landscape. So I know that's going to be a number that's going to be called out, but again, grain of salt, but they did see a bunch of redheads, which is good news.
Yeah.
And most likely they were new arrivals due to those really significant cold fronts. It's just sometimes they're underneath the aircraft and sometimes they're not. And this year they were underneath the aircraft by the thousands. I mean, it's not like they, saw a couple hundred underneath the aircraft. They counted tens of thousands underneath the aircraft. So,
yeah, that's awesome. That's right down there, like Laguna Madre.
Corpus Christi South, essentially.
Oh, okay. Perfect. Yeah. No, that's such a cool area. And I've been down there several times, and every time somebody talks about it, that's all I think about, those big redheads. It's pretty awesome area, and it's a pretty awesome bird down there. And it's really probably not expected that there's tens of thousands down there following a bunch of, multiple cold fronts on the heels of each other. I mean, that's what that is.
It has been frustrating for hunters, especially in the northern bays. As you get north of Corpus, there was historically a lot more consistent, a much more abundant numbers of scaup and redheads in those systems that they're not seeing anymore. And it is frustrating for them. And so that I'm sure that just makes them looking at, this very high estimate of redheads, all the more skeptic. But there's a lot going on with that bird, and there's a lot going on in those bay systems with human activity from hunting and fishing. And they're just getting more and more intolerant of, our actions. And when you do find them, and that's kind of what this survey suggests, is when you do find them, they're all together.
Yeah.
And, they're no longer, stretching out up and down the coast. They're all together, kind of, safety in numbers, if you will. And it just so happened that, they went underneath our aircraft this year. So,
well, it's very cool either way. I mean, and I think it's awesome that you are able to provide that explanation of that number for people who are looking at it. I think that's important.
Right.
As far as the geese goes, there's winners, there's losers here, just like anywhere else. But it looked like, some areas really improved as far as Canada geese and white fronts in some areas. And then snows kind of shifted a little bit historically, but it looks like you had a decent number of snows.
Yeah. So we do our goose survey a couple weeks prior to our duck survey. So it's typically the week prior to Christmas on the Texas coast. Everywhere else we do it in conjunction with our duck survey in January. So our coastal goose survey was flown the week before Christmas, again reminding ourselves that was right in the throes of record heat and dryness. And so realistically, our coastwide estimate of snow geese was 261,000 total snow geese for the entire Texas coast. That's actually was kind of shockingly high considering conditions. And so 261,000 sounds like a lot of geese, but as the hunters in the state of Texas and the people who reside in that landscape and have a history there know that's dismal compared to what it used to be. Absolutely dismal. And it's, just for the most part, extremely unfortunate that we're continuing to see these declines. So yeah, we did find, some good flocks. Again, these are where we do find geese, safety in numbers. They seem to all be together for a reason. They're not stretched out across the landscape. And it's kind of like I was talking about earlier with those ducks in the prairie. They're on properties where people are taking very good care of those geese, not harassing them, putting very little pressure on them, providing roost ponds. And so they're not necessarily available for everyone to see as they're driving down the highway. They're not flying across the landscape. And so it, again, more frustration, but luckily we do have landowners. We do have people that are out there still very, very actively providing habitat for these birds. And we see that. And that's what we saw here with that estimate. They were just in a handful of places on a few really good properties that are managing for them. One of the big frustrations is historically the Texas coast had abundance of not only white fronts, but small Canada geese. Our white front estimate for the entire Texas coast was less than 10,000. We used to count 500,000. Our Canada goose estimate 6 or 7 consecutive years was 0. We haven't detected a Canada goose on our survey in that landscape in a long time. So they kind of become the unicorn for that landscape.
How long has that been? Do you know just offhand? Has it been like 15, 18, 20 years?
So for like the last 6 years, we haven't detected a single Canada goose.
Okay.
Yeah. Historically, you go back into the 90s and 80s, Canada geese were kind of bread and butter down there, and people shot a lot of them. And, very, very common to count 300,000 small Canada geese in that landscape. And so the dark goose, if you will, white front Canada goose, is just kind of the disappearing from that landscape. We do have geese elsewhere in the state of Texas. And we found some really good concentrations, similar to what with the ducks. One of the numbers that really stands out is the Rolling Plains goose estimate. We have a chain of wetlands north of Abilene. I call it Winchester Lakes. It is some of the finest goose hunting in North America. Consistently, it's that country where you have a few wetlands and you have a bunch of agricultural fields, including peanut fields, which we all know what peanuts are like to waterfowl. And so it's a real good attractant. Really surprisingly, almost similar, identically to the playas. When we got there, there was very little water left. There was only just about 2 or 3 basins holding water in that whole landscape, and where there was water, there was geese. And so our total white-fronted goose estimate for that region was an all-time record high. We counted just over 102,000 white fronts, and some really, really large groups at a couple of real small spots. So, Arkansas clearly has the lion's share of those birds now, but in that landscape, they're pretty well spread out. And so my guess is that's probably the single largest concentration of white fronts in all of North America as we speak, in such a very, very, very small spot. So it's really cool to see. And we were glad to see that we still have those birds there. And looking at a little bit bigger picture, Canada geese, the goose numbers, Canada goose numbers are really driven these days by the high plains, the panhandle area. As I mentioned, we're extremely dry here. We were probably north of 50% of our basins wet in the end of July. We're way, way short of 1% of basins full right now. And so we had one of the driest, windiest, hottest falls I've ever seen. Every single day it looked like a dust bowl, or every other day it looked like a dust bowl up here. And it was just really tough on surface water. But what's interesting about this landscape is, there's still abundance of agricultural crops here, which obviously is a draw. But these birds so very quickly, in just a handful of years, learn that there's abundant, reliable, safe water inside the urban areas. And it's not a really abundant urban areas up here, but we have every little town has, a city park pond, their sewage effluent pond. And then obviously the 2 bigger towns of Lubbock and Amarillo have an abundance of surface water in the city limits, associated with borrow pits for construction or, city parks. And, it was way over 50% of the Canada geese we counted in the high plains were inside urban areas. What was the estimate? 440,000 total Canada geese, something like that. Yeah. So, it was a nice number. It was up quite a bit from the previous year. But what's really interesting is we didn't detect a lot of them out on the landscape, using playa wetlands as much as, finding them inside city limits. So we spent a lot of time flying from city to city, looking at all the little water that is associated with those towns. And it's sometimes just shocking how many birds can pile into a very, very small body of water when it's dry like this.
And that also is kind of as a real testament to these birds' adaptability. I mean, they will find a way.
Yeah, no, they do, and there's growing interest in hunting these birds. There's less and less places for people to hunt, and this one's certainly one on a lot of people's lists these days. And part of the birds seeking those water bodies inside those protected areas of the city limits has to do with the potential disturbance they're experiencing on the landscape, out on the countryside. And so it's just safe. It's safe from predators. It's safe from all kinds of things, and it's reliable. It's always there. It's pretty interesting how quickly they did that. We have a project starting hopefully this time next year or even earlier, where we'll start marking some of these birds with this transmitter technology, these small Canada geese, or what they now call cacklers, and learn a lot more about how they use this landscape, in addition to, some nesting ecology stuff and migration ecology stuff. But we're going to start peeling that onion back a little bit more and learning more about the behavior of these birds in the coming years.
Cool. Yeah, that's exciting stuff. So pretty much overall, like you mentioned, the midwinter surveys kind of indicated a 43% increase in waterfowl throughout the state of Texas based on 2021 numbers as well. So like you mentioned, that's a good thing, but 2021 was pretty much the lowest count.
Yeah, it was bad.
Ever.
Yeah, it was bad. So, I mean, like I said, we had nowhere to go but up. But like I said, even 2 weeks prior to the survey, I was certain that we were going to have a lower count than the previous year. And we were saved by those fronts. New birds pushed in. My colleagues north of us, in their efforts for doing the exact same survey, looked at a lot of ice. Is basically what they told me. So they counted very few ducks north of us, and so the birds really just didn't have a lot of places to go, and so that's what pushed them into the state. Right there at the beginning of the new year.
No, this has been great. Is there anything else about the survey that you kind of want to share with our listeners that think, maybe they should know about the Texas midwinter?
Well, yeah, I mean, I always get a lot of questions of timing, why it's done and why do you count then? Some people feel like that's not when the most ducks are here. And that's the concept of the midwinter survey isn't for us to, cherry pick the best time and go count. It's the timing is the only thing that we can control. And it's not just us. Historically, it was a very significant national effort. There's a number of states on both coasts, Pacific and Atlantic Flyway, that no longer fly it. All the Central Flyway states participate in the midwinter survey, and the vast majority of the Mississippi Flyway states do as well. And it's really designed to just kind of get a snapshot in time, a single moment when everybody's out looking around to get kind of a distribution of birds across the landscape. Ideally we would do it more often. For us to do this one survey, it's a Herculean effort. Effort for us to get, 3 planes with 3 crews in the sky and operate for, a week and a half. And so it's just really impossible, if you will, for us to pull the resources together to do it more often. And so it's a snapshot in time, and it's not, things can change the second we're done. Just like this year, things changed for the good right before flying. We have all kinds of examples where things change for the bad right before flying it, or right after we flew it, things started getting much better. And so it's really just a snapshot in time. It doesn't tell you the full story of the breadth of the fall or winter. And that's what hunters are experiencing. So
it's a baseline that you guys are all kind of following.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't. There's ducks coming and going like crazy. One thing we have learned from an abundance of new telemetry projects is just how much ducks and geese actually move. It's kind of shocking. Some of the movements that we're seeing, still not fully understanding why they do it. And so we haven't cracked that code necessarily yet, but it's shocking how much they move. And in hunters' eyes, and rightfully so, because that's kind of what we've taught them for years, and that's kind of what we thought for years, is it's always a north-south type of movement. The birds just got here. Well, yeah, suddenly there might be some new birds in your pond, but they could have very well come from the west. They could have very well come from the east. They could have very well come from the south. It's not like they only come from Kansas and Oklahoma and Nebraska. We have lots of interflyway transfer. We had one of our marked hen pintails from 3 years ago that was talking to us for 3 years. She spent, in that 3 years, she visited 3 different flyways in 3 different countries. And so these birds are sampling the landscape. They're moving around. Habitat and weather conditions are what is driving that. In addition to that, they're, like I said earlier, human disturbance is real, and they're just not going to sit around and let people harass them day in and day out. They're just going to go somewhere else. And one of the things that's good about this survey is we can start to kind of piece that pie together. Just being able to have the ability to say where we're seeing ducks in the state of Texas, and and seeing declines, long-term declines, and that's where these databases really get their power. Is you start building year upon year upon year. That's when the data starts getting stronger, and you can kind of start making references from it and seeing trends, true trends. So it's very important. It helps the waterfowl program in Texas make some good decisions. It helps have conversations with hunters. It helps even guide some of our restoration and habitat delivery, where we're going to spend money type things. And so it's a very important survey, but it can very, very quickly be misinterpreted. Very quickly.
Well, that's why we wanted to get you on here, to really kind of dive in and explain what it is. And I think another thing for people to think about, and it's something that kind of popped into my head, you mentioned that it's like a Herculean effort to get this survey done. I would imagine that someone, and I don't even know if they do, and I'm assuming they do, but the midwinter survey in Iowa is a lot different logistically than the midwinter survey in Texas, just based entirely on just the geographic landscape that Texas covers. That changes the game for even compared to Arkansas. Arkansas midwinter, that is such a drastic difference in just overall size.
Yeah, no, it is. It's not only when you start thinking about the breadth of the area we're dealing with. I mean, for the most part, the Oaks and Prairies ecoregion in itself is the size of Iowa, and so you think about the size of the state, and then. Yeah, I mean, the diversity of habitats in Texas is what really drives the methodology of which we fly. You think about Texas north, south, east, west, from prairie playas to coastal marsh and Laguna Madre to desert mountains with bighorn sheep, all the way to Caddo Lake, which is one of the largest swamps in North America. And so it's very, very, very diverse state that you have to have the right methodology to sample it, and it takes a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of planning, and things are changing by the day, it's one of those things we hope we can hang on to continue to have a little bit more educated conversation with our constituents, when they come to us with questions about, explaining where birds were and why our seasons were so poor, or, why our seasons were so good. It's the beauty of Texas is just as many people said it was terrible. I can find just as many people said it was one of the best I've ever had. And so for me, that's frustrating because not everybody's experiencing that. And that's that's all we care about is people being able to experience it and having a good time outdoors. And so it's tough. But that's what happens in a big giant landscape like this.
No, it's awesome. And kudos to you guys for pulling it off once again. I think everyone will find this very interesting. Even if our listeners are not in Texas, if you can kind of look at these numbers and, hear, what Kevin is talking about, maybe you can kind of relate to that, whether you're in Nebraska or Kansas or Arkansas, Louisiana, even Indiana, Illinois. I mean, the reality is these birds are potentially trading back and forth, where, as the science kind of is pointing to more east-west distribution throughout the wintering period. It's really cool, and I hope that everyone can really take a tidbit of information from this podcast, especially.
Yeah, we're just learning, and we're going to learn more about these kind of movements. It's imperative that we do, and as we get information, we're going to share it.
Awesome. Well, Kevin, this has been fantastic. I appreciate you joining me, and we'll have to get you back on as soon as you start pulling together more of this awesome information.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. Thank you.
I'd like to thank my guest, Kevin Kraai, Texas Parks and Wildlife Waterfowl Program Leader, for coming on the show today and talking about the 2022 Midwinter Waterfowl Survey results. I'd like to thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for putting the show together and getting it out to you. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us on the DU Podcast and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.